Hello, everybody. So tonight we might be able to end, more than 20 or 30 minutes early if we are at a good point. I'll have to wait and see where we are by 8. We might just, if everyone agrees, go on through without a break and end maybe even at 8:20 or so, or 8:30, instead of, having a break and going an extra 40 or 50 minutes after that, like we usually do. So I guess we'll just play that by ear if that's all right with everybody. We have less slides than usual, but I don't want to rush through them because, each topic has its own importance. And I'm going to now go to speaker view. We have a few things I want to tell you first before we get started with tonight's slides. um, First, the new extra credit option. Well, I've mentioned it, but I didn't have anything to show you. This is Marin Magazine. I've written now, I think the latest article I have in this month, that is November's issue, is about my 10th article for them. They do like freelance, writers who have some angle that has to have a connection to Marin County, of course, to get into the magazine. So this is my latest piece, and it's about what we covered last week, which is the legacy of the Miwok culture in the Bay Area. And if you find the link, it's easy to find under, obviously Google Marin Magazine, and forward it to me, so that I can see that you at least glanced at it. I'm not going to ask you to prove that you read the whole thing. It's not that long, but anyway, it was about that culture. And we covered it, most of the points I made, and except for the life of Chief Marin, his career, and it was a career, not in the modern sense of the word, but he didn't just do a few things and just be a spokesperson for a while. His whole adult life, he was a leader of the Miwok people, and in an indirect way of some of the Spanish missionaries, because of some things that he was able to do to reform. For instance, he got the whippings, most of the whippings, which were obviously outrageously egregious and abusive. At least I think it was Northern California. I don't know why not the whole system of 21 wasn't admissions, but at least all of the Northern California ones where he had, known personally that the whippings were being used as an abusive tactic to punish Native American so-called converts, because they didn't have a lot of choice being converted to Christianity. Most of them didn't. Anyway, he managed to get that stopped. He got a reform by appealing to the indirectly to the governor, the Spanish. Well, at that point, it would have been, it's hard, I can't remember what year that was. By then, it would have been a Mexican. Yeah, Mexican governor of the province of Alta California, which is what California is today, of course, as a modern state in the US. Anyway, he did a lot of things. That he was an explorer. He was a leader for his people, a spokesperson, a reformer. Pretty important. So the first half of the article is about him, and we didn't go into that much. It doesn't matter though if you do or don't read the whole thing. If you send me a link, you get 5 points. If by some small chance anyone here gets a hard copy and they can, drop it off at the art department office, or there's a couple ways to do that. Get in touch with me first and either mail it to me or drop it off somewhere in Santa Rosa on the campus where I can pick it up. You'll get 10 points. Okay, the other extra credit options are the architecture one, and I don't think too many people have done that. And I just realized I have to turn around and go grab a book here. Okay. We got to bring it to the front of, this corner of my bedroom, my office. Yeah. This book is required for Art 1.2 because we cover 20th, 19th, and 20th century architecture. But for those of you for extra credit options want to know about an easy option, see it's reflecting off the screen there. I wrote this book, 15 years ago. It's still in print. I think it came out, 07, so 14 years ago. This is the latest edition, which I did revise and update and so forth, because there's all kinds of new buildings by this woman. She's the first American independent woman architect, period. There's no debating that. She's the first woman in the United States to have fully professional licensed independent practice with no male partners required or otherwise depending on males to help her get clients. Pretty remarkable. But of course, it's not a topic for our coverage that we have, which is not anywhere near the period she was in. But for extra credit, I'll show you an easy option. If you go to either you live in or near, or you take a short drive, most of you live in Sonoma County, right? Or Marin County, to Petaluma. These are 3 of her houses that she designed in the old town. They're less than a mile apart. So for that 10 credit option, here, let me let.
Probably on D Street, huh?
Well, the addresses are below, but I guess I can send you an email if you need that. I'll probably create a, yeah, I'll just put them in a list. If
they just look like houses on D Street. I know that road. That's where all the nice old houses are.
I have gone by them even because they're well known to the Heritage Society and a few people at least in that neighborhood. Yeah, they're. I don't have the addresses in the captions. Those are in the body of the text. But the other one, the 4th one, is on that little hill above the B of A, which is just above the old downtown of Petaluma Historic District. And it has its own almost half block, must be a good solid near acre or something, or at least half acre of land. And that's, this one here. So she did 4 houses in Petaluma. And then what I forgot to tell my afternoon class, which is being tested on her work, is that she also did a building in Santa Rosa. And now that one you would need to take 4 photos. That means you would have to go inside. Hang on. It's the Chapel of Chimes on Santa Rosa Avenue as you head into the city. And for me to get to that one will take a minute. I'll show you a picture of it. It's one of 2 buildings that she had with that name. Here it is. Yeah. This building here, which is from the 1930s. And the first building I ever, first funerary building that I've ever seen in California that has a multicultural imagery inside. The stained glass windows have images of Jewish symbolism, right? Star David, and I think 1 or 2 other references to Jewish religion, of course, and Christianity, and at least 1 or 2 that reference Islam. Way ahead of its time. Multiculturalism wasn't even a term that was being used in the 1930s. And of course, she was ahead of her time in many ways. Anyway, that building you'd have to go inside of in order to get, let's see, to get the 10 points. It's 4 photos, either of the same site, which you, before the pandemic meant you go inside, take 3 photos of the interior, 1 of the exterior. But that's not practical in most cases. So 4 photos of the exterior, but that is only really, there isn't really 4 views. Well, you could do that. If it's closed or there's a funeral, of course, then you don't want to go inside. Obviously, then you could just take 4 photos of the exterior of the Chapel of the Chimes. It's a well-documented historic building. I'm sure it's on some historic, the website of whatever it's called, I don't, Sonoma County Historical Society, I think it is, would have the history of it. But you don't have to write anything other than the address, the name of the building, your name, and the class you're in. 4 photos in color in PDF and of any architecture site, or in the case of the 4 Julia Morgan houses, that's 1 of each, because those you can really only get the front of them from the sidewalk, but they're easily visible, and they're for photographable. I think I said that right. You can get photos easily from the sidewalk. It's legal to do that. You don't have to ask permission unless there's a person standing in the yard or, in the image. Then you have to wait till that person's there, because then that's a personal privacy issue. But if it's just the building, you don't have to ask permission as long as you're on public domain, and that would be the sidewalk or the street. But you don't want to take a drive-by photo from your car. Someone might call somebody and say, hey, there's some weird person. I'm just kidding. Anyway, get out of your car, park, walk up the sidewalk, stand in front of those 4 houses, 1 photo of each, put the address underneath or whatever, an attachment with 4, PDF of 4 photos, and send them to me, and you get 10 points extra credit. Of course, you could do that with churches, mosques, synagogues, historic buildings, whether or not you can go inside them. You can either do 4 exteriors or 1 exterior and 3 interiors if they're buildings that are open to the public. Okay, so that was my update. Oh, well, there is one more option. And I've already had a couple of emails from people. I believe it's in this class that one at least that's done this, and one that had a question about it. And it comes to the novels that I wrote, that's got to be, I know, way down the list of things that you'd even consider. So you can ignore that option if you want and do all the others, or not all the others, any combination to get 60 points. But if you want to take, a few minutes, that should be all it would take to just go on Amazon Kindle, and the two are both art related. That's why they were approved by the academic senate and the administration for a possible optional, totally voluntary. Don't have to even think about it if you don't want. But if you want to just check them out, one is about growing up in Chicago in the early 60s during the beginning of the civil rights movement and all of that entailed. And it was a pretty intense time. And yes, of course, it's semi-autobiographical. And it does deal with all the issues, literally almost all the issues that we're dealing with now, not even just since the George Floyd murder, but even before that, as they were back in the 60s, of course, just coming to public attention. Things, not just civil rights, but police behavior and responsibility and immigration and conspiracy theories, all of that. I got to see that happen, unfold in Chicago when I was growing up there. So that's called South Side Story. And the other one is an architecture themed murder mystery, which is called The Open House Murder, set in the 90s in the Bay Area, where the main protagonist, based on what I saw, and I did see some weird things happening when I was a real estate agent, The Open House Murders is titled. There were no dead bodies at any of my open houses, but there was one. That's what gave me the idea. One of my fellow realtors, I think they were in my company but different office, actually found a dead body as she was opening one of her open houses, but it wasn't one of her clients, and she wasn't being framed. That's the genesis of the story that I posted on Amazon Kindle. Again, all you have to do to get 15 points for either of those two is go on to Amazon Kindle, either order, or if you have Amazon, is it called Unlimited or Kindle Unlimited, then it's free, but you would need to show me a screenshot of the last page or the last chapter at least. That way I know you actually downloaded it, and that's worth 15 points. You don't have to prove you read it. If you do want to post a review, it could be 2 lines, it could be really brief, whatever you want to say. On Amazon Kindle, that's worth another 10. Okay, so I've covered the main, of course, we already covered last week, so I don't have to repeat it. The option of writing about a movie, that what you learn about an artist from a movie or a documentary about the life and work of any artist that interests you. I've never seen Basket. Did I say it right? Basket? Yeah, that one, I can't even remember who's in it, but he was pretty famous in the 80s. But there's so many. I already gave you guys 5. If you didn't see that lecture, it's already posted on Amazon. On YouTube. Sorry.
What is your book called?
This book is Julia Morgan, Architect of Beauty, and I worked on it with the woman who used to be her goddaughter. And why is that relevant? Because she has blueprints that people think were burned. There's a whole documentary on PBS about Julia Morgan. It was like 25 years ago. They got a lot of things wrong, because I don't fault them as an historian. It's possible to make mistakes because the research wasn't done very thoroughly. But I made sure I did everything I could to avoid those mistakes. One of them is a myth that she burned all her blueprints when she retired. No one knows why she did it. It was an act of self-destructive. No, she didn't. She burned some letters and things from clients and a few receipts and bills. Of course, you close a 50-year-long architecture practice, you're going to have a lot of paper. Back then, that was the only kind of record keeping. So she did burn some of her records, but not her blueprints. And this woman owns about 200 or more of her 750 buildings. Julia Morgan designed more than any American architect, including Frank Lloyd Wright. She outdid him by 200 more buildings than he did. And she had the problem of having the prejudice, of course, of the time she worked in against women architects. But really remarkable. I wrote my master's thesis about her. So it's Julia Morgan, Architect of Beauty, and of course it would have my name as the author. And it's in print. It's in the student bookstore, but I don't expect you to buy it for this class. I'm not suggesting that, but you can easily find the information about those houses to go photograph them for extra credit, or the Chapel of Chimes in Santa Rosa. If you check that, well, you could just Google probably. Okay. Or maybe there's a library copy you can check out and go to page 170 And that'll have the photos and addresses of the houses in Petaluma. I forget what page the Chapel of Chimes is on. Okay, so before we start tonight's topic, the first must-know slide, any questions about anything having to do with extra credit? Oh, your papers. I think everyone knows by now, so I'm feeling like a broken record here, but I am going to repeat just briefly, because not everybody was here last week or has yet gone on YouTube to see that lecture. This is the format that your second paper should be labeled with, and that is, of course, our 2.1 short paper number 2, underline last name, first name, then sent to Mark W at AOL. If you send it to my Outlook, I will get it, and it will definitely count, of course. But it's faster and easier for me to open and download. It just is. There's so much. The main thing I can tell you between the difference on somebody can say, oh, AOL, is anything efficient about it? Well, in several areas it is for this kind of purpose. It's much harder to delete stuff off the campus email. And there's all kinds of solicitations. I don't know why they allow that for a faculty email address. Anyway, so I hate having to navigate Outlook, but AOL, I can quickly get rid of all the, junk and then just focus on student papers and other important emails. So anyway, Mark W at AOL is the preferred address to send it to. And of course, the requirements are the same. It's due 1 week from tonight, but not until midnight. So you have over a week technically to turn in if you want it on time and not to have points off for being late. Any questions at all about any of these things that we're talking about?
Yeah,
now?
I have a question.
Sure.
You just answered one of them because in the email you said, oh, your paper's due on the 10th, and that kind of made me panic for a second. But the other question, I was just looking at the syllabus, and it was saying that, on the final, there's like 5 or 6 chapters from the art history book that we're supposed to know. Is it just read the entire chapters, or can you narrow it
Yeah,
down?
you should read them because well, good point. There might be some stuff. Yeah, if you want to take the time, the answer is a 2-part answer. If
I'm
you
just trying to
understand,
maximize my use of time right now.
no, it's fine. It's fine. It's a good point. And I think it is understandable, depending on how many classes you're taking. And most people I know in college are working as well as having a life and whatever, maybe a family or some other activities. I understand you want to, cut to the chase as much as possible. You could just go through each chapter, and when you see a reference to a slide that's on the syllabus, just read that section of each of those chapters. Or you can read them all, because that's the preferred way of doing it, because it gives you some context, some background, and points of reference or comparison, but you won't be tested on anything that is not on the syllabus. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Anyway, so
Yes, it does.
Yeah. It's your call, but if you've got limited time, just focus on the text that relates to the slides on the syllabus.
Oh, one more thing. Mark Anthony, huh?
Yeah. What?
Your parents were history buffs too, or is that a family name?
All right, I'll full disclosure. I'll keep it brief, because actually we're still going to end early no matter what happens tonight, but maybe we don't even have to have a break. But I will answer this, because my parents didn't give us middle names. Isn't that what the only kids we knew was me and my brothers growing up in Chicago that didn't have middle names. And our teachers would ask us, where's your middle name? It's like, we don't have one. So when we were in high school, we'd already moved to Southern California by then. My parents gave us the option of, you could do it back then. I don't know what the law is now, but in California, you could give yourself a middle name or ask your parents to give you one. Why would you do that? Up until your 18th birthday. So before our 18th birthday, our parents said, okay, now what do you want for a middle name? Yeah, I chose that. Okay. And look how many Mark Anthony Wilsons there are. Look in any phone book. No, phone book? Nobody looks at phone. There are about 5 in Berkeley alone. I didn't know that, of course, when I was 17 years old and living in Southern California. No, it wasn't my parents. But I am a history buff, so that's why I chose it. But look what happened to Mark Antony, not the same, Antony. That's the guy Cleopatra unfortunately seduced into self-destructive rebellion against his own empire and cost him and her their lives, right? You know that story. We covered it, didn't we? Or at least briefly in the early weeks of the class. Okay, so anyway, now any other questions related to grades?
Yeah, do we have to do this next paper on architecture?
I'm gonna, an important question. I've decided to be more flexible because it would be, I think, a good experience because you eventually, if you take any 4-year college level art history courses, you are going to have to write papers on somewhere about architecture, whether it's ancient, you know, whatever, medieval, Renaissance, modern, whatever. But in this case, I'll give you the flexibility to choose. Now, I've already sent everybody,
You do
right?
anything?
Yeah. So if you choose to write about a sculpture or a painting, drawing, or photo, I would not reject it. You can. I'm giving you that flexibility. I'm going to enforce that rule once we get back to in-person, mostly classes, and I'm teaching courses that are covering 20th century art and architecture. I will enforce it then. But right now, I made that rule up before, you know, when it was easier to be able to answer people's questions and there was a break physically, I could sit down and give people advice on how to write, or they could send me, you still could, of course, a sample of your paper. Don't forget that. You have that option, but don't wait till the night or even 24 hours before it's due. If you want me to give you feedback, you need to get in touch with me, send me by PDF attachment and ask me, tell me it's not your final draft, but at least give me feedback or response. And then I'll do that as long as it's 48 hours at least before the due date. So,
And you're going to send us a sample copy of the paper, right? I think there was something you were sending in an email.
no, I have to send you the cover sheet. I
Oh,
already
that's
sent
right.
a sample of the paper to everybody at the beginning of, not the very beginning, I think it was the second or third week of class.
Okay.
Yeah, because I say, unless you join late, in which case it should still be in your student portal. This is an important question. And if it's not, email me and I can forward that to you. It's a sample A paper from back when we all were doing in person with the cover sheet filled out by hand and the whole paper attached as a PDF. So I sent that to everybody. If you didn't get it, let me know as soon as you can. And so tomorrow, probably too late by tonight when you finish, for me to check my email again after I have another class. I just finished teaching another full length Zoom class. So at this point, by tomorrow, if you ask me to, I could forward that to you. But I sent that out, and the cover sheet, that's going to help me. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, whoever's going to email me about any of these questions, just say, just a reminder, you know, send the cover sheet, because otherwise I won't do it until Friday. And that's not that late, but I'm sure you'd rather have it before the weekend. For those of you trying to finish your paper early or otherwise just have it all, the material to gather together. So I will try to make sure I send it by the end of the evening Tuesday. If someone can remind me, I'll probably remember, but just as an added backup. Okay. All right. One more time before we start the first slide. Anybody have any other questions about extra credits, your papers, or grades? Okay, so let's get started now with the first must know for tonight. Tonight's topic is art of the early Middle Ages, and it's sometimes referred to as just early medieval art. And of course, we're talking about Europe at this point, since that term now applies to other cultures, not just to European culture. But that's because historians want common, just like, you know, AD and BC used to be, and now CE and BCE are common references for people around the world, especially professional historians and, you know, people who, journalists, whatever, document anything about, you know, the timing of something. They have to have a common system of measurement, just like with Greenwich median time, or I can never remember what that is, meridian time. Yeah, where the hours are set by you know, a scientific institute in outside London in Greenwich, England. So how did that happen? That's a topic for another class. That's a Renaissance thing, but the world agrees, you know, just to have some kind of a common reference. So we say medieval in this class for this lecture, it means Europe, but it can mean the same period of time in any other culture, by the way. Mostly we're thinking of Asia and the Middle East. Things were very different in other parts of the world during the Middle Ages. Okay, let's get this full size. There we go. It's our first must know, and I won't be cutting this slide from the study list. It's a pretty important one for this week's topic. Okay, the title is Purse Cover, just like those words are always spelled. Purse Cover from Sutton Hoo, SUTTON Tton, and then the second word is capital Hoo. I've always thought that that name of the site where it was found, Sutton Hoo, it's a near a town by that name in southern England. I always thought it sounded like the title of a Dr. Seuss novel that never got published. Sutton Hoo is a town in England for which this from which this site was found near that town. So the location is the country of England, and the date is 630. Another tip for the wise, you could write this down or just remember it later or watch this video. There's a movie called The Big Dig, or is it just The Dig? It's The Dig. Yeah, just those two words. It
Great
was well
movie.
done. Yeah, really well done about the finding of this medieval burial site with hundreds of artifacts. They're all in the British Museum. I've seen them. And I'll tell you what not to do when you go to see them in a minute after I tell you the meaning and the formal analysis. Anyway, it's the story of how an amateur archaeologist found all these incredibly, priceless artifacts from their own country's history, and how a bunch of, well, I have to say there's no other word, academic know-it-alls from one of the nearby universities tried to take over the project and shove him out of the way and take all the credit. And the woman who owned the land on which the site was found luckily backed the amateur psychologist. I'm an amateur archaeologist, and he's to this day given credit because he was actually smarter about how to save. You don't just start shoving your shovels into the ground, an archaeological site, and just start shoveling dirt or sand or whatever and just keep going till you hit something. That's not how it works. And so if you're interested in that concept of what is involved in a very delicate operation of retrieving over almost 1,500-year-old artifacts that have been buried in the ground for 15 centuries, as well as the whole, drama, and it was a dramatic thing about, it was right before World War II started. In fact, I think the war actually was underway by the time they got all of the artifacts out of the ground. So it's called The Dig, and it was, I think, Netflix. Anyway, that would be another option for extra credit if you wrote a short 2-page summary of what you learned from that. All right, so here we go. The meaning of this. Well, let's start with the fact that I just said this was found in a royal, and it was a royal. I didn't say that before, so you want to write that. In other words, a king's burial site. We're almost certain this was owned by one of the early kings of England. In any case, we know it was somebody with royal blood, and therefore the ruling class of what was then, of course, not England yet. There was no England. They were Anglo-Saxons, the ones who were there after the Romans left and dominated what's now southern England. So the site was in what today is southern England. At that time, the culture that ruled that area they were called Saxons. They were Celts, right? Celts with a C, of course. And the Celts were master goldsmiths, or you can say metal workers, because they'd only use gold, but that was their favorite metal, as well as wood carvers. They were superb. All the Celts, not just the Saxons. The Celts is, a huge chunk of Northern Europe were Celtic. And they go back before the Roman Empire, of course. And the Romans conquered most of them, but not all of them. The Scots and the Irish are Celts, and the French, the early French, the Gauls, but these were Celts that were in what's now England. And they were Saxon, S-A-X, of course. O-N was the name of their culture. And their metalworking skills shows here very, very clearly, because this is gold. What looks like gold is real gold. But what does it mean to say it's a purse cover? Yes, real men and kings carried purses in the Middle Ages, but not the kind of thing we call a purse today. It's more like a fanny pack, or even perhaps a side pack, where you might carry it, slung across your shoulders when you were traveling. And what would you carry, or would a royal, let's just say king. We'll go ahead and say king, because I can't remember if they proved that the person who owned these, because they didn't find, I don't think, any of the remains of the human remains, was the actual king, or someone just high up in the royal family. Anyway, we'll say probable, a king. What would a king carry in a fanny pack like this, or purse, which had a cover? This would be what was on top, and the leather pouch is long gone, because leather would have disintegrated in the ground after that long. Okay, so inside, this is all part of the meaning. this pouch, you can call it pouch if you prefer, but we'll say purse because that's the official title, were three major kinds of objects, three main types of things. The first were the most valuable jewelry, or just say favorite. I better say not necessarily most valuable, but the favorite jewelry of a king. Why? Because when they traveled, kings wanted to have such ornaments. You can say bling if you want, I guess. The word, of course, didn't exist in the Middle Ages, but their favorite jewelry with them so that they could, their rings, and necklaces, perhaps, bracelets. They obviously they would have shown off their wealth because of the quality of the material, which would probably have been gold. And these, by the way, are gold. The red is garnet, which is a precious stone, and the blue is our old friend from ancient Egypt. You remember this term, lapis lazuli, which the Egyptians love using. So there are two precious stones, and one, the most precious metal, of course, is gold. Those are the items that this is made out of, all very valuable. So the jewelry would have been made out of valuable items, and the king's favorite jewelry would have traveled with him whenever he went to, another part of his kingdom. He would take some of those things with him. So that was one thing that would be inside this purse cover, or inside the purse or pouch beneath the cover. The second thing would have been important documents that the king wanted to keep with him, or even in perhaps some cases, take to have signed or witnessed or otherwise shown to some other important person somewhere else in the kingdom, like a duke or, some other kind of person who would have had to perhaps help enforce something the king wanted, some new rule or law. So we'll just keep it simple and say, various important documents were the second type of item carried in these pouches or purses by kings and other important royal family members. The third thing is what definitely in this case only the rulers the kings would have, and that is a signature ring. And I think some of you know how this works. A signature ring, right? It's always a metal. It wouldn't always be gold, but it could be with the monogram, right? The kings were some of the few people, well, even many of them were illiterate this far back, but at least many of the royal family members, certainly most kings, could read, along with their top, ministers or advisors, and almost all monks. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what you have here, there we go, is the third thing that this fanny pack, or if you want to call it pouch, could contain, besides the king's favorite jewelry and important documents, would have been a signature ring, where he would have pressed that ring into hot wax to seal an envelope. Yes, they had not really envelopes, but just say a document. If I say envelope, you have modern idea what that is. They didn't have envelopes, but they had folded over documents made out of parchment. Of course, you don't have to write all that, but any important document that you don't want anyone else to see except the person it's intended for had to be sealed with a signature ring. And always the king, when they traveled, carried those. They always carried them with the right. I think even now some of the royal family members do that in England and France. Oh no, oops, the French don't have it. England, Belgium, wherever, Spain, I guess a few other countries in Europe still have royal families, right? So back in the Middle Ages, it was essential to bring your signature ring if you were the king, wherever you traveled, because that proved the documents you were bringing, were from you, and that also protected them from not being seen or opened by anyone but the person you intended to have read it. Okay, that's half the meaning. We have less slides, but a little more information on the meaning for each of the slides tonight. The other half is that this is an example of the animal style. It's a brilliant example of that. So here we go. Our first definition. There are three for tonight. Remember, we covered animal style with the ancient world for the Babylonians with the, let's see, what was the bull lyre, panels from a bull lyre. Remember that one? We had that definition, different definition. That's why I put it in parentheses. You see in the middle of this page that you should be looking at now of your terms to know, where I'm going to give you the definition. It's about 2 lines long. Animal style as in medieval version. And here's that definition. A style of art in medieval Europe, okay, in which animals were depicted with human-like characteristics. Oops, I misspoke. I apologize. You guys, no one hollered at me, and I thank you for that. So I'll start over. If you start writing that, that's the old definition. Scratch it off. I will restate correctly the new version. Okay, animal style. Medieval version, sorry, is distinguished from the ancient version. It's a style of art in medieval Europe in which animals were used to symbolize the strength and power of the ruling classes. So this is just one line. It's a short, much shorter definition than the earlier one. Again, I'll repeat that. It's a style of art in medieval Europe in which animals were used to depict the strength and power of the ruling classes, period. That's what you see going on here with these figures. In fact, once you know what you're looking at, it's kind of grisly, actually, both of them. What we have are two large birds of prey scooping the brains out of much weaker animals. So it's almost like well, it's not almost, it is a case of the ruling classes, the rich and powerful, however you want to phrase that, not only ruling over or, having control over all the other people in their kingdom, but having the right to do whatever they wanted to any of their subjects, and no one could say anything about it. And we'll see more examples of that as we go through the couple more slides tonight.
Kind of like today.
Well, it's not that bad today. It can get that bad if you work for Jeff Bezos. I'm kidding. He's going to cancel my Amazon account now. No. Yeah. In other words, you wouldn't be able to get away with automatically just any a violent act against a subject and never even have to face trial sometimes, but I think most of the time we at least try to hold those people accountable. Let's go back to the specifics of these two images. First, you have these images and then these, and they're both in the animal style. So we have in the middle two sets of birds of prey scooping the brains out of weaker birds, and that symbolizes the ruling classes having the power to do whatever they want to their subjects, and they couldn't be questioned. The other images on either side are of a poacher. That's what most historians, again, there's no written records here, but we have enough evidence from the actual period of other works of art and the history of that era. So it's not really guesswork. It's pretty definite that this is someone who poached on the king's hunting grounds. And guess what he did? Sick two very large, vicious dogs on him, and he's about to get torn to pieces. He doesn't look happy, does he? Well, he wouldn't be. See, these dogs have him literally in their grasp, and they're biting him on, or maybe they're just starting with his ears. Anyway, he's not going to walk away from it. So just write it this way, so that the side images on either end of the two sets of dogs with an unhappy human in the middle illustrate what is probably what's the word for that, death by there's a word for it and I can't think of it. Dismemberment by dogs. You say when vicious dogs were set by the king's guard, because he didn't usually have to do it himself. His wardens, game wardens who ruled over his hunting grounds would have seen an intruder and sick the dogs on him, and that was the end of that guy. Probably just trying to get food for his family. He wasn't going to get home that night. So anyway, so these are two sets of figures that are definitely part of the animal style, and they fit that definition. Another part of the animal style that's less violent, that still fits within that definition, are the dragons. These dragons are not just in Europe, but all over the ancient and medieval world in most cultures, at least in the Eastern Hemisphere. You could just say it that way. I don't think there were dragon images used certainly not by the Plains Indians, but they were by the Mayans too. So you could just say many, if not actually just say many, keep it simple, of the ancient and medieval cultures. Remember, I said the word medieval can apply to any part of the world in terms of the time frame that we're covering. 500 to about 1500 is roughly what most historians agree was in the medieval era. The early part is called the Dark Ages, not the whole thing. We'll explain what the difference is with the late medieval. It got much less of a dark age, although still pretty much so by our standards. Things began to improve slowly after, the middle of that period. So this is still during the early medieval period or Dark Ages, in which kings had total control and the right to do whatever they wanted to their subjects. But here, this is just symbolic. Dragons were symbolic of the fact that that's what they had, the total power. They were symbols of the power, right, of the ruling classes without needing to have any violent imagery attached to them. They're usually just on their own. These are two where they're odd looking, well, four actually, it is in each section is two dragons. It's kind of thin looking dragons, and they aren't breathing fire or they're not winged, but they still qualify as a version of the animal style medieval, definition of it. And they symbolize the power of the ruling class. So we're pretty sure this was owned by a king. And he ordered these details to be put into this work of art. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. Now let's do a formal analysis, and then I'll tell you the one little bit of advice, a little 60-second anecdote about what not to do if you ever get to see the actual piece, which is at the British Museum in London, as are all the other artifacts that amateur archaeologist found. Okay, so it is warm, isn't it? Everything about it is warm, except the little details of blue here, the lapis lazuli. So there's some small, little bits of cool colors. That's not part of the original design. That's part of the museum exhibit. So what would have been there would have probably have been, it could have been enamel. That's what that is. It could have been, but we have no way of knowing. So it was probably some of the leather, the pouch itself that this was on top of, maybe, or another set, stretched piece of animal skin, of course, hard perhaps leather that would have, been used as part of the purse cover. But that's not part of the original, so don't confuse that. The background is modern, added by the museum. So it's almost all warm gold and red, except for the tiny spots here and there of cool blue. Okay, and then we have the rhythm, of course, the sets of 4 dragons, 4 birds here, 4 dogs and 2 hapless poachers. And all the geometric patterns, they're quite lovely, aren't they, around the edges and on these clasps here. So rhythm is just powerful here. There isn't a straight line in it, except the very, very top. You could make the case the border on just this one little section. That's not even 5% of the total. So it's way more than 90%, just say almost entirely dynamic because of all the curved lines. The largest mass, I don't think you can say that. They're almost all equal, these. But if you count this as one single section, and you could because they are joined, then maybe that's the largest mass. And some people think the birds of prey are larger than the dogs that are devouring that man. That's up to you to decide. Otherwise, it's hard to say. But I guess if you had to break it down, you could say the largest single mass would be the centerpiece at the top. And then it's one of those other 2 sets of animal style imagery on either side, or the 2 in the middle. Okay, then we have balanced, completely symmetrical. I'm amazed. When I saw this, I thought there must be something about it that's, when I see it in person, it won't be as refined and as skilled as it. No, it's complete. It's, how did they do that? They didn't have very many measuring tools then, right? So it is very, very balanced, symmetrical, left to right and top to bottom. Okay, and then we have for space, the only technique, of course, is overlapping of the animals over, well, the 2 birds, the bigger bird over the little one, and then the dogs over the hapless human, and these dragons over their, well, is that their tails? I guess it is, or just over the patterns. So there's only overlapping, no other technique for space. And the textures, is there similar texture? Yes, there is. This guy has a buzz cut. I don't know what else you want to call it, but that's what I call it. The guy about to be eaten alive. And then these birds' feathers, there's no question. And to do that with metal, you see why they were considered the Celts, the greatest metalworkers in the early Middle Ages anywhere of any European culture. They were really masters at that. So there is some there are some areas of simulated texture on the birds and the man between the two dogs, but not anywhere else really. So mostly it's just, the texture of the real texture of smooth. Remember, the materials now are smooth lapis lazuli, the blue stone, garnet, the red stone, and of course gold, the dominant material. There's no modeling anywhere here, and the lines are all bold everywhere, wherever you look. I don't think I see any thin lines here. Yeah, okay. I think that's it. Covered all 9 elements. All right, let's move on to the next must know. Now, this one, I had a color image of it, and somehow that disappeared from my file, so I replaced it. Let me just see. I think, yeah, no, it doesn't. All right, so here's the next must know. I'll tell you what the actual color is, but here it looks like it's gray, doesn't it? It's not. It's actually a warm kind of kidneys, like, the color of kidneys, quite literally. It's kind of tan color. Okay, this next must know, the title is Stag Staff, that's with 2 F's, Staff, from Sutton Hoo. I'll spell it again, Sutton Hoo. Same place, same site, same burial grouping, I guess you could call it, because there was more than just the king's belongings in that burial site. Sutton, and the second word is HOO. Sutton Hoo. And again, of course, the location would be the same, England, and the date, 630. By the way, remember on the numbers, now we're getting to where the numbers are more often specific. Like when we get to 1015 or 1555, they're not already rounded off. So when I said you could round off the numbers, I meant just if they aren't already on the midterm, and the same applies for the final. So most of these dates this week's lecture are, but next week you'll see a lot of them aren't. And so you could just round off, and that would mean to the correct decade, not the correct century. That won't get you credit on the final. Remember that. And I'll repeat that when we do the review. All right, so what do we see here? A staff, and that is another definition, right? You see it down here below animal style. Staff. Well, a staff is a stick, usually of wood or metal, and usually, they're not all exactly the same, but usually of wood or metal, a stick usually made of wood or metal, comma, and normally about 2 feet long, which symbolize the power of the king that held it, or ruler. It didn't have to be a king. It could be an emperor, or a shah from Islamic culture. So I'll say it again. A staff would be a stick usually made out of metal or wood, and normally about 2 feet high, comma, or 2 feet long, I should say, which symbolized the power of a ruler. In other words, they carried it with them wherever they went in public, and they would have it in front of everyone who came to see them. They would hold that staff. Of course, mostly we're talking about people sitting on a throne, and the kings, especially in Europe, would have the people walk up to them, and of course the throne is on a raised platform, so they're already looking down at the person, and then that person looks up and sees a staff, a stick, and they're usually decorated too, but not always. They don't have to be. But this one is the end piece. What we're looking at now, the meaning of this slide now for this set of notes on the second must know here, is that this was the end piece for the early king. Well, now we know that it was a king. I mean, when you add up all these clues, it's pretty obvious that whole burial site was primarily for him and his maybe immediate family, and possibly some other members of the royal blood, as they called them. But anyway, this would have been carried by a king, because it was, if you can imagine this, attached probably by metal clamps to most likely a fancy carved wooden stick, but it could have been metal, a staff that would have been about 2 feet long, and then this piece is about 5 inches from the top, from the the hoofs, the bottom to the top of the antlers is about 5 inches. So if you could imagine this faced outward, I think you can visualize that pretty easily, right? And this piece that's damaged here is when it got broken somehow, somebody probably long before, right? The actual burial site.
I have a question.
Well, let me just finish. This would have then be the very end piece, the decorative end piece on a king's staff, which he would have carried or held with him whenever he had a public audience or met with anyone in public. Okay, go ahead. You had a question? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious, was there like remnants of a staff next to this? How did they know that's what it was? Because by itself, I wouldn't know it had anything to do with
No,
it.
I know. I'm sure there was. There almost had
Okay.
to be, but who knows what was, left of a piece of wood buried in the damp English earth. You know how damp and soggy the climate is in England, if you've ever spent, as I have, several months there of the year. Yeah, so probably there was just something left, part of what wood would have disintegrated pretty much, except there would be some remnants. They could have traced through carbon. I think most of you know what carbon dating is, right? They could date these things, so they'd have to guess the age of them, and then probably they would also have a way of measuring if there was remnants of a wooden stick nearby. So I don't know that. Don't write that, but it's a good question. Again, you might want to check if you feel like it for extra credit about what was found at that site more specifically as to this piece. And if there's any kind of a page or more of a text about that, forward it to me. You get extra credit. And if you do, I'll probably think of remember or try to remember and tell people next week in class if there's some definitive thing. I haven't seen anything about it. Believe me, in the British Museum, there was so much information. First of all, it was 18 years ago, the last time I was in London. And second, it's an overwhelming section. The things they found, they had hundreds of objects from this website. This grave site. Sorry. Boy, they were ahead of their time. They had a website in 630 AD. Now, from the grave site, there were hundreds of pieces, but this was buried along with or nearby, if not right next to that purse cover. And there's enough other pieces that historians are confident that these were owned by kings, these last 2 slides. And so that begs the question, why a stag? I bet some of you can guess. Anybody? Why would a stag be an appropriate symbol for a powerful ruler to have at the end of his staff? What message would that send? Well, what is a stag?
King of the forest.
Pardon? Sorry. No.
King of the forest.
Oh, king of the forest. I thought you said a kind of horse. Oh, sorry. The audio is not always perfect. Sorry, my apologies. It's Rob, right? You're right. Yes. King of the forest isn't bad. In other words, the most powerful male deer, of course, is the stag. The one that runs, what is it, a herd? I can't remember when a group of deer, there's 5 of them living across the street from me here in Berkeley on my residential street. And the stag is pretty big. I don't want to mess with him when I take my late night walk. Sometimes he comes out from behind 2 houses and I just give him wide berth, right? But he doesn't have antlers this big. So yeah, the most powerful male member of, isn't it a herd? If you want to correct me, anybody, go ahead. I think it's a herd of deer would be the stag. It's the ruler of that group of deer. So it's a perfect symbol for a king to put on the top of his staff, and to have as a symbol of his power when he is in front of anybody that he's it's called giving an audience, right, or meeting with anybody. And he wouldn't need to do that with a high-ranking minister or someone who's coming to negotiate something. He wouldn't constantly have this in front of him, but anytime he's in an audience with a group of people in front of him, he would carry this, mostly while he's sitting on the throne. Okay, can anybody guess? And that's the last part of the meaning now. It's not a minor point. What could a king use this type of decorative piece at the end of their staff? How else could they use it besides just symbolizing their power? You might think of another possible use of it.
Scratch their back.
Say it again.
Scratch their back.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that one. Okay, that's a new one.
You're
No.
thinking about something more violent, probably.
Yes,
Huh?
I am. Well, I think you guys are, I don't know if you could tell what I'm trying to hint at. There is another possible use, and it is not the most common, but it isn't that rare. Anybody know what else you could do with something like this if you were standing, or sitting rather with this in front of you and it was faced outward with these antlers, these points facing the person in front of you? Okay, well, I guess you guys are been a long day or whatever. Okay, you could use it as a weapon. And if you think that never happened, I have a famous example that if you don't know about this, you don't have to write this example, but you could easily look it up. And if you haven't chosen a topic for your second paper, you could choose this because there are several paintings of this scene. Ivan the Terrible. We're going to talk about him at the end of this evening, the last must-know slide, who is the most violent and some would say mentally unstable of the czars of early Russia. Well, it wasn't that early, but anyway, medieval Russia in the 1500s. He killed his own son with a blow from his staff, which wasn't a stag staff, but it had some kind of a sharp point on it. He killed his own son in front of a room full of people in the Kremlin, in Moscow, where he had his palace and where he ruled from, because his son wouldn't let Ivan the Terrible sleep with his wife. That's a fact. It's well documented. I took a tour of the Kremlin, actually more than once. I've been to Moscow like 4 times. They'll tell you that, in this room, Ivan the Terrible killed his own son. And there's famous paintings, one in particular, the most famous version of that scene where Ivan the Terrible is weeping, holding his dying son, bleeding from his temple, where he just hit him because he killed him. He died within, a minute or so after that, in his arms and asking for forgiveness. So we'll talk about that again when we see the last slide tonight, which is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow outside the Kremlin walls. So in other words, it's not the only example either of Ivan the Terrible. It was not hardly the only medieval king that ever used their staff as a weapon. It was known to occasionally be used when a king got angry enough at someone standing. But so it's another kind of way of warning you not to challenge the king, knowing that that could happen, and then the king wouldn't be punished. He wasn't punished for killing his own son in front of a room full of people, even though it was his heir apparent. Be like a president killing his vice president and then just walking away, Oh, well, it just happened. That almost happened with Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. If you don't know that story, you can see the play. The movie version is now on Netflix, I think it is, or Amazon, of the play Hamilton. Yeah, but that even then they weren't sitting White House figures. So what we have here is a mostly symbolic detail or section. Here's a better word, a section of a decoration. Actually, that's a better word. Decoration at the end of a staff, primarily just to symbolize the power of the king, but it could also be used as a weapon. Okay, plenty on the meaning. Formal analysis. It's balanced. Oh yeah, very carefully. These two. Now it's broken a little, but when it was new, these antlers were the same height, right, on either side. And of course, he's standing upright with his legs together, so it is very carefully balanced. I would argue top to bottom and left to right, but certainly left to right. To me, top to bottom, because if you drew the line across the lower neck, the antlers equal pretty much the same area as the body and the legs below. To me, it seems roughly balanced both ways, but definitely completely balanced, or very much so, from left to right. And then it's a single mass. You can't really break it down. The texture is the smooth texture of polished, and it is polished stone, but there is simulated texture on the antlers, rough simulated texture of, I don't know, antlers aren't they hair? I think antlers are made out of hair, aren't they? Like rhinoceros horns are, I know that. So you could just say antlers. The antlers have the rough texture of real antlers, so that's simulated. And I would say on the face a little bit, the ears maybe, just mostly in the mouth. Otherwise, the whole rest of the body below the head is just a real smooth texture of the polished stone. And there is no modeling. This is in the British Museum. And so the lighting from the museum causes the modeling. There's no technique for it. For space, as I said, it's a real three-dimensional object that's about 5 inches tall and about, I think it's 4.5 inches long, about that. So nearly the same length as, well, it's taller than his wife, so maybe it's 4 inches by 5, but it's about 5 inches tall, and it's all real space. There's no techniques for space here. It is both stable and dynamic. The whole bottom part of it, the body and the legs, that's very stable. Well, even the neck, but then everything around from the head on up to the top. The antlers is, of course, dynamic with a lot of curved lines. And then we have, of course, the rhythm. The antlers form rhythm. The head has the two eyes, two ears. And then, of course, the legs, even though they're close together, they do form rhythm. That if you even just want to look at them as, clumps side by side, that's still the repeated shape of groupings of legs. But actually, there's a hint of separation here, and then the hoofs. So there's plenty of rhythm throughout the piece. And the color is actually a warm liver color. I don't know any other to tell you because I couldn't find an image that was good, clear, sharp, and allowed to be downloaded, on the internet that was in color. After, I assembled these slides for this semester. I always try to update things if I have time. So the real piece, I think it's photographed in your Stockstead, though, I'm pretty sure. Or of course, you can find it online. Is a kind of a warm tan or liver color, so it's not cool. And there is line here, carved line on almost entirely limited to, well, the face, the eyes, and the mouth, but some would say on the hoofs. Let's just take a closer look. I don't see too much there. That's mostly so it can stand upright. Okay, now I'm going to tell you what not to do if you go to this exhibit in the British Museum. I think they call it the Sutton Hoo Collection or something like this. It's a whole big section. It's more than one room, but one room in particular with these glass cases, which are below, of course, they're below eye level. They have to be, but they're down to where I guess people, early teenage, field trip students from middle school could see them easily and still be looking down at them. But for me, they were a little too low for me to get a good look. So when I was standing not in front of the case with this one, but this case, this piece is so valuable, I don't think it can even be insured anymore. I remember being told that. And the reason I was told that is because I almost got myself in trouble by looking at it the wrong way. So be careful if you go here. What does that mean? Don't lean over the display case. And I was about to put my hands, I wasn't going to harm anything, but, on the side so I could, because it's, I had to lean quite a bit over from where I was standing. But before I even got my hands anywhere near the edges of, this guard came out and he had his, he had a gun. He didn't have it out. He just had, it in a holster. And he said, "Sir, step away from the display case." And there was apparently some silent alarm. I don't know how that operated, but he was actually standing there. He saw me. So he was polite about it with his British accent. And I asked him, I said, "Oh, really? But it's kind of hard to see the detail. And I teach a class, because I don't care. There's no exceptions." He said, "But I will tell you this, the piece, in case you're wondering why we're so, strict about not getting too close to it, because it's too valuable to have the museum have an insurance policy on it. That's that valuable. And the last time I checked it, it was insured. It was probably 100 million, and that would have been a few decades ago. Okay, so just don't get too close to display cases in the British Museum when you're there. All right, the next must know is this one. Cross page from Lindisfarne Gospel. Cross page from or of. See, I don't take points off for prepositions. You can use any preposition. I hope everyone knows what a preposition is. I don't have time to explain if you don't. So if you, in other words, on this slide, if you were to write cross page from or in, right? But the title that Stockstead gives is of Lindisfarne Gospel. I'll spell that for you. Capital Lindesfarn. Lindesfarn. It's a town in England. Gospel means Bible, of course. England, the location again, of course, 700. So what have we got here? All right. Well, what is an illuminated manuscript? And that's what we're looking at. This is an example of an illuminated manuscript, and that is only the second definition, or sorry, the last of three. I meant three. So it's our final definition for tonight. It's on the same page. You see it above animal style. Okay, here we go. An illuminated manuscript is a hand drawn and written. Well, you can just say handwritten, keep it simple. A handwritten manuscript created by monks in a monastery with several richly illustrated pages. It could be, a dozen, or it could be several dozen. Depends on the length of the book, what the subject was. I'll say it again. An illuminated manuscript would be a handwritten manuscript created by monks, that's M-O-N-K-S, in a monastery, comma, with several richly illustrated pages, period. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. One page out of an illuminated manuscript. Illuminated, I have to say it slowly. Okay, but why is it called cross page? Well, that should be pretty obvious, but if it's not, you definitely want to write this as the next fact about the meaning. Hang on a second. I have to get the frog out of my throat, as the saying used to be. Okay, there we go. It is a cross design superimposed over something. Well, what is that? Can anybody tell? Well, if you read Stockton's, you already know. Animals, specifically snakes and birds. The snakes are coiling around some of these very small little birds. You can barely see them here and there. So snakes and birds, well, what is that? An example of the animal style. But here we're not talking about kings and rulers having power over human subjects. Not that. That's not what this is. So what you do, right, is that this symbolizes, well, let's see if anybody want to take a stab at what you think. The cross is superimposed over all of the animals. And the fact that the cross is the largest and most important symbol, the whole thing is called the cross page. Every Bible, gospel is a Bible, hand illustrated or illuminated manuscript of a Bible would have had a page with a cross on it. But why would you think the cross is superimposed over these animals?
I'm assuming the snakes maybe are to represent Satan or his influence.
Close, very close. Basically, you're in the right. Yeah, in other words, the snakes symbolize the pagan beliefs of many of the people that would have come to this church. This would have been used in a church service, and no one, could most people in the congregation, they call our audience, couldn't read then, but of course, priests could, and the other monks who might have made it might also be attached to that church, and then of course, eventually they might get a visit from a ruler or a bishop.
I think this place got the first documented visit from the Vikings too, did it not?
Uh-huh. You're right. The Vikings attacked England at this town.
Lindisfarne was the first one.
The first raided town in England. You don't have to know that, but you could if you want to add that. We're going to talk about the Vikings after we finish this, but we have a couple more things to say about the meaning of this.
Wait, do the birds represent the enlightened, I guess, in their viewpoint, or what?
Well, that's a good question that no one I've seen has 100% certain answer for. So the most important thing, I'll tell you what we do know. The cross in and of itself, that is this whole red outline image of a cross, a gigantic or large image of a cross, superimposed over the snakes, is symbolic of Christianity being dominant over paganism. That's literally the easiest, the shortest way to say it. It's symbolic of the fact that Christianity is now dominant over paganism. Until the Vikings arrived, as you point out against Robert, they were not Christian. No way. They refused to convert to Christianity, and they were pagans. But they hadn't made, when they made this, it wasn't yet known that the Vikings were going to take over big chunks of the whole British Isles, right, and many other parts of Europe. We'll get to the Vikings after. I think it's the next slide, but let's focus on the fact that again, everybody should have that in your notes. The use of the cross here is symbolic of the fact that Christianity has now become dominant over the old pagan, and everyone knows what pagan is. I've already defined that, right? Non-Christian religions. That doesn't mean that everybody in England, we're talking about a country that had been converted to Christianity hundreds of years earlier under the Romans, they'd converted, that they all gave up their old pagan gods, but they had to worship them quietly behind closed doors, at home, in private, however you want to write that. They wouldn't be allowed to worship them in a church. Of course, only Christian teachings were allowed in a Christian church. So it symbolizes that kind of power, the power of the new church of the Catholic, well, relatively recent. And yes, all of Western Europe was Catholic. There were no Protestants in, but you can just say Christian or Catholic hierarchy of the church, dominant over the old pagan beliefs. And so the snakes and birds are just in general, most people think, just meant to symbolize the older pagan religions. And yes, maybe your point, I guess, again, Rob, that is might be also a secondary meaning, is that snakes are almost always associated with Satan in the Bible. So yeah, that could easily be part of that. So it's a good example of Celtic skill, because the monks who made this were well, Saxon. They would have had to have been, before the Vikings came and forced them. Well, I don't know, either killed them or forced them into slavery, or closed their monasteries and made them go live a normal life and marry and have children. But what we have here are Celtic imagery around the borders, are these geometric patterns that we saw to some degree. Well, just to make the point, let's go back. You see what I mean about the geometric motifs that Celts artisans or craftsmen were famous for. And you see them around the edge of this image here of this cross page. So there's a hint of the Celtic culture here too. Definitely was a Celtic culture, but so were the Vikings. It just, they were a whole different branch, much more warlike branch. Well, everyone, the ruling classes were all warlike back then, but the Vikings, we'll get to them, were even more so. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning of this, except, oh, this is the first page you would have seen in a Bible. It would have been called the frontis piece. You don't have to write that word. It's always the first. It's still the term used by publishers and at least some writers, myself included. I get to choose what I want for the first illustration from all the photos that my photographers take of all the books I've written, the 5 books I've had published on architecture. I get to say, we want this to be, and if they don't want it, the editors or the publisher can change their mind, but usually they allow the author to do that. So this wouldn't have been even a choice, though. This would have been the first page, first illustrated page at least, or just say the first illustration inside the cover of a Bible. In almost every Bible made in a monastery, that would be the case. The cross page is the first page, you'd say. Okay, let's play on the meaning. Formal analysis. It's balanced left to right, but you'd have to say, because the cross has mass, if you imagine it as, what it would be in a church, a solid piece of stone or wood, right? It would be weighted toward the top, wouldn't it? If you draw the line, of course, down the middle. So you'd have to say it's unbalanced toward the top in that regard. Technically, the overall shape of it is balanced. So, of course, it's a rectangle. The entire border just creates a rectangle. But with the crosses, if you consider it to have its own mass, then you'd have to say it's unbalanced toward the top, balanced left to right. And then, of course, the largest mass would be the cross, regardless. And then it would be the snakes and then the birds. Or would you want to say the Celtic decorations or geometric patterns maybe are a second largest, because they're all about the same size. And then third would be the snakes, I guess. And fourth would be the birds that they're crushing in their coils. It's dynamic on all of the detailing inside the borders, but the borders, of course, have straight lines. So it's a mixture of dynamic and stable, but mostly dynamic, because the cross, although the stem of the cross and the arms form, pretty much upright lines, the outer edges are all curved, of course, and all of the snakes, the animals, the snakes and the birds underneath the cross or beside it are curved lines. So it's mostly dynamic with some stable detail on the borders and the overall position of the cross. Now, here there is overlapping. It's the only technique for space. The snakes overlap the birds, and the cross overlaps the snakes and the birds, of course. That's the only technique for space. There is no modeling that I can see, but is there simulated texture? Well, let's get up close. That's a hard thing to say, but some people think they see some simulated texture, but I don't. So I would just say it's probably not any simulated texture that's visible here in this image, at least. Now, what about the textures? Let's see, modeling. Oh, colors and line. Yes, colors here are a mixture of warm and cold. Of course, it's warm on the outer border, well, the entire border, I should just say, of the cross, and warm on some of the snakes, but the alternating snakes are blue and of course, or bluish green inside the cross, and that would make those parts of this cool, of course. So it's really just a mixture of both. The lines mostly bold outline around, it definitely is, in fact, a bold outline on the borders and bold outline on the cross. And then we have thin outline on the snakes. So it's got some of both. Okay, well, it is 7:48, so I don't know if people want to, have a consensus, if there is a consensus. I kind of could use a break, but on the other hand, I could bowl through, I guess. We have 3 more slides, though, and there is a lot to say about at least 2 of the 3 remaining must-knows. Actually, I'm going to cut one of them. So let's just go ahead then. Is that okay with everybody? Right? Anybody object? No?
Hold on.
Okay. All right. I've decided to cut the second from the last one because it's the most boring slide from this selection. And why don't we do that now as a group while I put the next must know on the screen? Yeah, I can finish up by about 8:15 or 8:20 if we just keep going. And then you have the rest of the evening off, of course. Okay, so everyone take your pen or pens.
See, that looks more Nordic to me.
Oh yeah, we're about to get to that. We're not cutting this slide. This has a high possibility of being.
I don't know if you ever noticed that, but I've always kind of been fascinated with the Nordic scrollwork, and it seems to me the one thing that totally distinguishes it from Celtic is they're almost always like asymmetric. The Celtics always seem to be very symmetrical, and the Nordics are not.
Oh, okay. Well, let's talk about that in about 30 seconds. When we get to this slide, it is the next must know. But first, so everyone has this, everybody now with your pens, take them out and cross. Well, you should have them in your hand already. Take notes. The second from the bottom of tonight's list of slides, the doors of Bishop Bernewald of St. Michael's. It's a snooze, as the saying goes. I know I could get fired for saying that. I actually upset a professor at UC Berkeley once when I asked a question about one of the slides and said, why are we seeing this? It doesn't look very important or interesting. Nah, I shouldn't have said it, but that was just my honest opinion. Anyway, that one, everybody got that now? Nobody's in any uncertainty about it. You don't have to worry about that. It's not going to be on the exam. It'll be one of the 40% that I will count towards a total of 40% that I cut from the final study list. We don't even have to discuss it tonight, though. It's just off the list. Okay, doors again of Bishop Bernewald at St. Michael's, Germany. Not on the final, not going to be a part of tonight's lecture, but this one is, and I'm not cutting it from the study list. Ship's Head from Oseberg. Ships should have an apostrophe. Okay, I wouldn't take points off if you didn't have the apostrophe because it's missing from this part of the syllabus. But that's a possessive, of course, not multiple ships, right? It's one ship's decorative piece. Ships, with a comma before the S, head from Oseberg. It's a town in Norway. Oseberg. One word, of course, capital Oseberg. The country is Norway. In Norway, I think everybody knows how to spell Norway, and the date is 8/20. Now, before we get into the meaning, it sounds like maybe it's Robinson has a question or a comment, and then I did want to ask about that.
I'm sorry, I just geek out. This is my favorite stuff. But is this that ship that they dug up in 1909 or something? It was like the Queen's.
No,
ship.
And that's a good point. But before we get to what this is, because the title, I have this issue. I know, again, I'm not supposed to say this. I'm breaking some rules. I like Stuxted. I do. It's a good book. It's better than Jansen, the one we used to use. It's way more inclusive and up to date and all that good stuff. However, sometimes she uses titles that are misleading. We already covered that with Justinian and his attendants. That's not even close to correct. They're not his servants. We covered that, remember, a couple of weeks back, was it? I guess. And this also is misleading. This is a tiny little 4.5-inch piece of bone that probably, here's the first part of the meaning now, and so I'll say it slowly and repeat it. This is a carved piece of bone that served as the decorative model for a full-size ship's head. This piece is about 4.5 inches long, 4 to 5, maybe it's 5, just say 5. But the real ship's head, even as fearsome as the Vikings were, if you put a 4 or 5 inch piece of wood on the front of your boat, no one's going to see it. So, of course, the real one was like 5 feet long. So this would have been, in other words, most historians, again, I always say it that way in your notes to make it, more accurate, just to cover all the bases. Most historians believe, I certainly do, that this served as the model, or was a model, for a much larger wooden ship's head with the same pattern or design. Because of course they would have done that to create the big ones. So actually, I guess again, it's Robbie, to answer your question, no, this is not from that ship. It's from a different site. And I don't even know if they found part of a ship, but I know the one you're talking about. It ended up in Chicago at the Chicago World's Fair. I think it was 1890 something they found. Unless you're talking about 2 different ships. You might be talking about 2 different sites because there's more than one that's been found. But one of them was found in the ice somewhere in the very northern part of Scandinavia and brought to the Chicago World's Fair. I know because my great aunt was married on that Ferris wheel. The first Ferris wheel ever was at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And also all these foreign exhibits were there that had never been seen in America. And one of them was a real Viking ship, which then stayed for some reason in Chicago. When I was a kid, I used to go, they let you play on it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was, 9, and so I didn't think I was doing any harm. And it disintegrated pretty much. So they've restored what's left of it and put it inside a museum somewhere near the Historical Museum of Chicago. I think they still own it. It may not even be on display. Anyway, so the one you're talking about, Robbie, where was that found? Do you know?
I believe it was in Augsburg also, but it was buried in the ground there. It was like it was a ship that was buried with a queen, a lot of her
possessions. Yeah, royal burial. They did that. They buried either their rulers or the royalty or their most powerful warlords, like today we might say generals. With either the ships that were associated with them or just a large ship as a way of symbolically saying they're going to take a cruise to the next life, right? And some of their belongings with them in the ground. Yeah. But here's the point. This piece I want to clarify, and you have to write this now. I'm going to tell you several more facts about the meaning, but before we get to those facts, you should have just written the thing about this being a model. So now you can pause for a moment. Again, I think it was Rob. You said Nordic versus Celtic. I've done some reading, but it sounds like you've done a lot too. Maybe more than me. What I understood was that Vikings or the Nordic cultures were a branch, an offshoot, whatever you want to say, a variation of a Celtic culture, because they had so many similarities in their artwork. And you see that in the last 2 actually 3 slides that we've been covering. So have you heard something different that Nordic?
Well, I know there's a lot of debate about who influenced who in the artistic style. I've heard it go both ways.
Yeah.
But I mean, they were contemporaries. So, just to me, it was just an artistic style that I know.
Oh, okay. Really Nordic style as opposed to saying they were a different.
Yeah, it just seems like the Celtics are always symmetrical and very well balanced, and the Nordics are always kind of asymmetrical, and that's where you can usually tell them apart.
Yeah, again, people don't need to write all that, but if you want to check into it, of course, that's another possible topic for an article for extra credit, if you want to forward it to me. But I'll just add this, that at least many, actually I would say most, but just say many historians consider the Vikings to be a version of, or a branch is a better word, of the Celtic people, because of their origins genetically as well as their art. There's differences, though, you're right, and those are what you're focusing on, but I don't think genetically they're as far apart as 2 distinct. Like, for instance, the difference between the Basques, right, in the mountain, don't write this, the mountains between Spain, right, the Pyrenees that divide Spain and France. The Basque are a distinct language, distinct genetically from the Spaniards, which they're part of Spain, though. Right. So that's true. But I don't think there's that big a difference between the Nordic branch, if there is such a thing, of the Celtic culture and the Celts that lived in Northern Europe at the same time.
There's a lot of crossbreeding going on.
Well, that's true, definitely. But that came from what we're going to talk about now. So now you can start taking notes again. Okay. Which is the fact that what this symbolizes about the Vikings is that they had three qualities that they were famous for. First, they were the fiercest warriors in the whole Middle Ages. Nobody argues with that. You don't have to write it this way, but you could say whenever they attacked any site, that would be a town, a castle, a monastery, they never lost a battle. I don't know of any examples of them losing any battles. When they engaged an enemy, they almost always won their battles. So in other words, again, you don't have to write this, but if you were living in any part of Europe where the Vikings were coming ashore and you could see their ship coming, or ships, you had two choices: run or die. Or if you were a woman or a child, you would be sold into slavery. So that's pretty much the only fate of anyone's culture that they attacked. And yeah, they did attack all over England. They went all the way around Europe. So I'll say it again. The first fact that distinguishes the Vikings from other medieval European peoples or cultures is that they were the fiercest warriors of all of Europe during the early Middle Ages. Second, they were great craftsmen, and that's sort of what we touched on. But without getting into the thing about the Nordic versus, only for your notes, you don't need to get that detailed. But you could just say that they were master craftsmen with wood carving, which of course this may be bone, but it almost certainly served as the model for a much larger wooden carving, which would be on the front, the prow, of course, right, of a Viking longboat. And they were called longboats. That's a word you probably should put in your notes. And that leads to the third thing. In other words, they were great craftsmen in both metal. See, on that they had in common in the broad sense, you see what I mean, with all the other Celtic cultures. Because other Celts were also good with, we just covered that and saw the evidence of both metalworking and wood carving. And definitely the Vikings were. Some say the best with those two mediums of wood carving and metalworking. But they did that, of course, with their weapons as well, as not just decorative pieces like this ship's head or model for a ship's head. The third thing I think is the most important: they were the greatest navigators on Earth during their golden age. The Vikings, basically, as a culture, this pretty long time, it's like 400 years. You don't have to write that in your notes. They first started conquering areas outside of what we now call Scandinavia, right? The Nordic areas of Europe. They started invading and conquering all these other parts of Europe in 700. Well, we already mentioned that, with the first ones being the British Isles. And then they went all the way. If you don't know this, you might want to write it, because it's part of the meaning of who they were, the culture that created this work of art that we're looking at. They went all the way around the Mediterranean. They landed in the Byzantine Empire, and some of them were hired as bodyguards for the Byzantine Emperor because they were such fierce warriors. They did not, unlike their fellow Christians, sack the cities of the Byzantine Empire. They had some kind of an arrangement where they didn't. And then they went up to the Black Sea and into the interior of Russia. Look how far that is, to go all the way, first by boat and then across the land. They put their boats on their shoulders and carried them from between, say, two rivers or two lakes. Because look at a map of Russia. There's a lot of rivers in Russia and lakes, but it's mostly a solid landmass, Western Russia, right? And they invaded and settled, and yes, intermarried, as I guess, again, it was you, Rob, that said they intermarried with a large percentage of the population in those cities that or towns, they weren't really cities, in Russia. You can walk across parts of Russia, or drive, or I have done all the above, or take a train and visit some of the towns in, not Moscow itself, it's too cosmopolitan, but some of the smaller ancient towns that are well over 1,000 years old from when the Vikings invaded that area. And you can see Scandinavian features, not Slavic, on some of the people's faces. They were descendants of the intermarriage of their ancestors with the Vikings. It's an amazing thing. But the last and most interesting fact to me, they are the first, quote, and I'm going to say it in quotes, Europeans to discover the New World. 500 years, you know some of this, some of you know this. If not, write it then down as the last fact about this, that boats with this kind of decoration on them, longboats, Viking longboats, crossed the Atlantic 500 years before Columbus. And not only that, they knew where they were. They knew it wasn't Asia or India. They knew it was a new land. And they settled in the northern eastern corner of North America, all the way from Canada down to Massachusetts. There are Viking relics or artifacts found. They're not fake. They're the real thing. Now, there have been some fakes over the years, but in those areas of the New England coastline all the way up to Newfoundland, right, which is Canada, there are over 100 years the Vikings had settled in those areas. Eventually, the native warriors drove them out, and they abandoned those sites. But for about 100 years, they called it Vinland. VIN, as in vines. They could actually grow vines, and there's still wine grown, and probably not very good wine. I've never drunk any New England wine, but They still do make wine in New England. But the point is that there were Viking colonies or outposts. They weren't really colonies. That's overstretching. That's like a whole kingdom or something. No, they were just little towns on the coast. But still, for over 100 years, from the late 900s or around, you could say around 1000 to about 1100. That's centuries before Columbus. They were the greatest navigators on Earth, really, to have done that, to have gone all the way, almost, 2/3 of the way around the globe in opposite directions and settled in those areas.
In an open ship.
Yeah, right. In an open ship. Yeah, that's even more amazing. They were tough dudes. Yes, no question about that. Okay, so now let us do the formal analysis, and then we only have one more slide, and we will end around 8:20-ish. But let's not rush through this because there's a lot to say about the details here. The carving that we've been talking about since I first put this slide on the screen, of course, that creates texture, which is done with carved line. So the line here is carved, right? Obviously, all the line. But it appears to have some limited simulated textures on the lips. To me, that's the back of the mouth, and even on the teeth. They're broken a bit, but they definitely look like teeth. And the snout, you could just say the nose if you want, because it's really only the end of the nose or snout, except either word. The mouth, including the teeth, the snout or nose, and some think the eyes have similar texture, but to me, that's not very realistic. It's just, the bulge of an eyeball. The rest of it is just decorative patterns. Again, those very, very intricate, intertwined patterns that look like snakes to many people. They probably are. But what is this creature? Now, I apologize. I should have said this at the end of the notes you were taking on the meaning. No one knows what it is. I've had people write papers about this for many years, and I've read articles about this and other similar patterns used for Viking decorative heads on Viking ships. Sometimes they were obvious what they were, say not even the lions or anything, but still some kind of fierce animal. We can't identify. Is it a sea creature? Is it a sea serpent? Is it a dragon? Is it some kind of a vicious dog?
I think those two are almost interchangeable to them, the sea serpent and the dragon, though.
Yeah, as well as some of the more fierce animals like, dogs of prey, or what do you want to call them, the largest dogs that they might have taken with them, perhaps. I don't know if they took them on their longboat, so I don't know that much detail. But in any case, they definitely would have had hunting dogs with them when they invaded places. They would have and settled. So is it some kind of a dog-like, a wolf-like creature? Is it a mythical? It's just some kind of fierce mythical animal that we can't really identify, and maybe is not meant to be identified. So what is simulated on it is just really limited to those details. The rest is carved line, which form, of course, patterns that are totally dynamic. There's not a straight line here. Even these checkerboard patterns on the upper snout have a curve to them if you look closely. So I'd say it's entirely dynamic. It's one single mass. There's no large or small mass. This is not part of it. If it's not obvious, that's part of the museum exhibit. It's this, piece of wood they use to display this. So it's not part of the original. Here, the modeling is from the museum light, but it is part of the composition too, because it's meant to have, this is bas relief, of course, right? Raised patterns off of a flat background, deep shadows. And that would be in the sun, of course, when it was on a ship or outside being used as a pattern for a larger ship set. In any case, however you want to describe that, these deep shadows are part of the design. So it does have modeling as one of the techniques. Very, very dark and deep modeling, whether it's in sunlight or indoors in a museum. And then it is balanced. Yeah, I've seen it from the front. It's symmetrical. Here, I would say too, if you do a line down here, the area covered from where the neck would be, that's not part of it, remember, up to about the area behind the eyeball is roughly the same mass or area covered by the front of the face. To me, it looks balanced both left to right and top to bottom. Again, if you do a line across the middle, it's pretty much even, roughly balanced. And the rhythm is obvious. The intertwined, we'll say snake or snake-like patterns. And of course, the geometric patterns on the eyeball, or just, you can say eye, sorry, not the eyeball, the eye and the snout create rhythm, as do the teeth. The color is a warm color, right? It's a warm kind of off yellow almost color. This is a pretty accurate color image of it. And let's see, is there any technique for space? No, yeah, there's some. You could say the snakes overlap each other if you want to count that as technique, but the actual space is the real size of the three-dimensional object in real space is roughly 5 inches long. Might be closer to 6, but it's close enough. Say about 5 inches, and that's all real space. I don't really see anything on the face that's overlapping. Okay, so let's go to, yeah, it's only 8:08, so good. We'll probably go to about 8:20 or 8:25. Then I'll stick around as long as you guys have any questions at the end. Okay, now this is a very famous site, but a lot of you might not know by glancing what it is, but it's our last must know for tonight. St. Basil's Cathedral. And Saint is abbreviated, but you can write the full word out if you prefer, of course, but here it's abbreviated on the syllabus, ST period. And then Basil's is name of an early Christian saint from Russia. B, of course, capital BASIL, and of course, apostrophe S, Basil's, St. Basil's Cathedral. I'm pretty sure you all know how to spell cathedral, right? Common. And the location is Moscow, of course, MOSCOW, 1555. So there's a couple things to say about this, the meaning of this. First, let me just take a quick bit of coffee here. Okay, first of all, this is the most famous Russian Orthodox church in the world. Nobody would deny that. It's the one, if you've ever seen an image of a church in Russia, it's probably this. It is the most famous Russian Orthodox church in the world to people all around the world. It's in front of the Kremlin, and I wish I had my own slides, but I didn't have a chance to get them transferred to digital form because I have a whole roll of slides I used to show of Moscow. Fascinating city. It's the capital, of course, of Russia. And for most of its history, it was, but then it briefly, for about 150 years, the capital moved north to what's now St. Petersburg. But Russia was the capital of Russia. Sorry, Moscow, I meant. Sorry, Moscow was the capital of Russia during the entire Middle Ages when this was built, this cathedral. So it's in the capital city, and it's in front, no, you can't tell from this picture, of the walls of the Kremlin. Where my arrow would be, they'd be all the way over about here. I don't think I have another view. No, I don't. Yeah, that's for next week. That's a really important slide. Next week we'll cover it. Okay, so that doesn't tell you much about the meaning, except that where it is, it's in Red Square. They called it Red Square because it used to be where the communist government had all their soldiers, tanks, and missiles parade every year on their anniversaries of the Russian Revolution. So it's called Red Square. It's one of the largest public places in the world, and it's at one end of Red Square, outside the walls of the Kremlin, which was the royal compound of the czars of Russia. If you knew you'd repeat that, well, that's pretty important because that's the context where it is. It's at the end of one of the largest squares certainly in the world. Yeah, it's going to hold 300,000 people. That's pretty big, bigger than St. Peter's in Rome. One of the largest public squares in the world, called Red Square, and it's outside the walls of the Kremlin, which is where the czars had their palace complex. There's also churches and other buildings in the Kremlin. It's like a city within the city. So just outside the walls of the Kremlin. Why is it there? Well, there is one story about it, and it's back to that one about Ivan the Terrible. It was built by Ivan the Terrible. He hired the architects. This is all part of the meaning that I can repeat if anybody needs me to any of these facts. So I'll try to just say them slowly for you to get them the first time. Ivan the Terrible ordered this cathedral to be built, and some historians believe it was to show his penance. Don't ask me to spell that word, or remorse, if you prefer that word. Others might say guilt for having killed his own son. I told you that story, but if you didn't, of course, you wouldn't probably have written before. You should now. That this was built not long after Ivan the Terrible had killed his own son with his staff in a heated argument, or just say in a fit of rage. That's a better phrase. Ivan the Terrible was known to have many of those. That's why he was called Ivan the Terrible. He didn't want to upset him. He killed his own son inside the Kremlin one day in front of a whole room full of people. And there's no proof of this, but some historians believe this was built as a way of assuaging his guilt, or as penance, that concept, right? That the church says if you did something, sinful, you should do penance, right? But there's no evidence for that. That's just one theory about why it was built. But we do know is that Ivan the Terrible hired the two greatest architects in the Russian Empire. That's what it was called at this time. He expanded the Russian Empire more than any previous czar. And a czar, by the way, that word some of you probably have never written. It's C-Z-A-R in English translation. It means, in essence, Caesar. Actually, that's what the word means in Russian. But you could just say ruler, absolute ruler, emperor, if you want to call it that. More than a king, even. He didn't even have a parliament he had to talk to, like they already had by that time in England and France. So he was an absolute ruler, and he was called the Tsar, right? Tsar Ivan the Terrible, and he expanded the Russian Empire. So he was popular with the masses, but people were afraid of him because of his temper and his cruelty and brutality to people, that anybody that he thought was in any way criticizing him or opposing him. Well, it sounds familiar. You know what Putin does to people, puts poison in their soup, or some other deadly method. So this guy would have openly just had people executed if he heard they were criticizing him. But he did not mean or intend to kill his own son. So we don't know if that's why he built it, but we do know that he hired the two best architects in the Russian Empire. And he told them, there are two more facts about the meeting, that he wanted the most beautiful church ever built in the Russia, just say in Russia. And I think they succeeded. Most people agree this is a rather remarkable building. It uses the Russian invention of the onion dome and the Byzantine concept of, yes, there is a central dome. I've been inside it. You can't see it because it's under the bottom or base of this tower, the central tower. But it does use a dome resting on pendentives. And the overall shape of the building is a Greek cross floor plan. So it is a Russian Orthodox version of a Greek Orthodox church. But the Russian part jumps out at you, stands out so much that people don't think of it that way because of all the onion domes and the colorful patterns on them. Yes, this is the original colors that they would have had back in the 1500s. Now, one last fact about it that is actually
So drab.
Pardon?
It's so drab.
Oh yeah, right. No, I love this building. I've been, like I said, Moscow several times, and every time I go, people were just oohing and awing, walking around with video cameras and kinds of now phones. Well, when was the last time I was in Moscow? Oh yeah, it was 2005 when we adopted my daughter. Yeah, and we took her there. There's one of her favorite photos of her in a little stroller in front of this building with the Russian tour guide that was with us taking our three of us, our photos. So she had that connection to her heritage, even though she wasn't born anywhere near Moscow. On the other side of the coast of Siberia, the Pacific coast is where she was born. Okay, so this is symbolic of Russia to people around the world for obvious reasons. I know it's using a bunch of video games I've seen, which are, or movies, spy movies that when the KGB is involved, there was always some secret meeting or something. Somebody gets killed in front of this at night or whatever. Anyway, it's world famous, and it is on the UNESCO World Heritage List. But the last fact about the meeting may be the most entertaining and amusing, because tour guides have been telling visitors to Moscow, naive tourists, in other words, that when Ivan the Terrible saw how beautiful this was, he didn't want those architects to ever build another church this beautiful. So he had their eyes put out. I believe that the first time I went to Moscow, but I wasn't with a Russian friend who lives there. And the next time I went, this is before I ever knew I'd adopt a daughter from Russia, I stayed with a Russian family, and they just laughed when I said that to them. They said, "Oh, that's the oldest piece of baloney ever told in Russia." Here's why we know that's not true. Because these same two architects, they were, a team, went on to design a whole bunch of other churches all over Russia. And believe me, blind architects cannot design anything. So it's just a myth. It's a silly myth. They tell tourists, and probably they have fun laughing about how many people, His eyes get wide. Oh, he blinded his architects. No, he didn't do that. He did that to other people who were his political enemies and things, but he didn't do that to the architects. They continued working for many more years. Okay, so that's the whole meaning. So we can wrap it up just about when I was saying, around 820-ish. But let's do a full formal analysis, because this has some varieties, surprising varieties of color. Is it cool or warm? I see it as mostly warm, but there's so much green and blue, both in the onion domes and in the decorative trim. You can call it just trim, or decorative outlines around it is brick. It's a brick building. So it wouldn't be safe here in California. They don't have earthquakes, at least not this part of Russia. I think they do in the Pacific coast area, but not here. So it's a brick building where the brick is warm. The domes are a mixture of cool white, blue, and green with warm yellow and red. And then the most, of course, prominent, the tallest or highest of all the onion domes is real gold. That is gold. So it's a mixture of cool, warm colors. Okay, and then for line, well, this is complex. There's all three kinds of line here. There's carved line on the brickwork. No question that is decorative carved patterns here. These, arrowheads or pointed motifs, and then the arches and some of the more decorative, you could just say decorative detailing is done with carved line on the brick exterior. Then there is painted line. Well, of course, it's on the onion domes. They're painting, they form thick, maybe lines, but they are lines that swirl upwards to the top of each onion dome, and that's all painted line. Let's see, there's no drawn line. That's right. So is there a visual line? Well, yes, all buildings have that. And wherever the sun creates the impression of a line, especially right here at the edges of or corners of these multi-sided towers. So there's visual line, there's carved line, and there's painted line. There is modeling here, but it's not so much a technique for the design of the building. The modeling, of course, again, is the shadows created by the sun. So it's natural modeling. For space, it's a single building with a large open domed, main room, the worship, prayer hall, you would call it that, right, where you would stand for by the way, anybody been to a Russian or any kind of Eastern Orthodox church? Real quick aside, you don't have to write this. You have to stand for the entire 2 hours. Most of the services are 2 hours long. I know, I've been to a couple. Man, no seats. So it's one large open room, prayer room, you can say, or main room, if you just want to say it that way, in the middle with a dome ceiling, above which is a tower that reaches a height of about 120 feet. If you count all the way to, you see the top of that Greek Orthodox style cross. You see the cross there. It's more of a Russian version of that. So just say from the foundation to the top of the tallest finial, it's a finial on top of an onion dome, is about 120 feet. And there are several smaller rooms around the main prayer room, okay? The largest mass is the tower, right? Clearly. And then it's about equal. Each of these towers to me seem almost the same, although this one looks a little wider. So you maybe say the tower that's to the far right seems slightly larger. And then these two are pretty much the same size. Or you could take the whole bottom section below the base of all the towers and call that one section. That would be the second largest then. The rhythm is obvious with the onion domes and the swirling patterns and the carved decorations in the brick. It is almost entirely dynamic. There really isn't any, there's a little bit of straight line, I guess, if you really stretch it, just at the corners. And that's only formed by the visual line from the sun, shadows of the sun. So it's almost entirely dynamic. And then let's see, my texture is the real smooth texture of metal. This is painted metal and gold, and then real rough texture of brick and stone. That's inlaid stone, the white part, onto the brick walls. So real rough brick, real rough stone, real smooth metal, and including gold. And then, yes, there are windows. So you could barely see them. There's some glass here. Actually, they're set way back behind these. Here, there's very, very deeply set stained glass windows that are real smooth glass texture. Okay, balanced. I don't know. You could make the case in this view, it's more weighted or unbalanced somewhat towards the left. Whereas if you think of, if you walk around it, though, there's another onion dome on the other side. It depends on which angle you look at. But in this view, you could just keep it simple and say in this photo or slide, it appears to be somewhat unbalanced toward the left and definitely unbalanced toward the bottom. Okay, we pretty much have finished. I will say one last fact. What happened to this cathedral? I meant to say this, I apologize, at the end of the notes on the meaning. During the communist era, the communists were atheists, no question, at least in most official communist regimes, including China, Vietnam, Cuba. I've been to all those places. I haven't been to Venezuela, but anyway, you pretty much have a government saying religion is, not something we recognize, or let alone not just encourage, but we discourage worship, religious worship. Well, that's what the communists did when they took over. But toward the end of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, whom I had the honor of meeting once, one of my heroes, to help bring down the Soviet Union, if you might recall, in the Cold War, the last, right, premier, they called him, right, or dictator, in other words, of the Soviet Union, was Gorbachev, and he opened the churches again. So this building, in other words, during almost the entire communist era for 70 years, was empty except for a warehouse. It was used as a warehouse to store military supplies inside. No one was allowed to go in unless they had a special permit. There was no church services. And then around 1990, in fact, that's the first time I went to Moscow. I remember going inside that year. So you can just say toward the end of the communist era, if you want to add that, you don't have to for the meaning. The last ruler of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, he was dictator, right? But he gave up his own power willingly without any violence. It's pretty impressive. How many leaders do that? We've seen a couple that didn't want to, right? So he declared religion acceptable, and people were allowed to go into churches, mosques, and synagogues all over Russia. So he reopened them. So it is now a functioning church. It's no longer the Cathedral of Moscow, though. That was a much bigger building that was built in the 1800s that moved, was about a mile away from here in a different part of Moscow. So there is a cathedral and it's functioning. It's much bigger. But it was the cathedral for several centuries of the whole greater Moscow area. And it is now still today, or once again, a functioning church. Okay, plenty of notes, I know. So you guys have any questions about anything we've covered tonight, about your papers, which are due by midnight, 1 week from tonight, of course, on the 22nd, or extra credit. If you joined late, I think one or two people might have. I gave several options and one or two new ones at the start of today's lecture, which of course will all be posted on YouTube by this weekend when this lecture is posted. Anybody have any questions now about anything we covered tonight? Your papers, extra credit, anything else? Anyone? Nobody yet? Or at the moment? Okay. If you still have questions about, your grade, you can email me and I'll tell you how many points you have. But almost nobody has gotten more than 20. I think one or two have 30 points extra credit, meaning that even those with the most extra credit still have several tens, 30 or so more points they could earn if they choose to. And many people have no extra credit. So there's something you want to think about, perhaps, getting, some extra credit in your column, so that it's part of your total and helps make sure you get the highest possible grade at the end of the semester. And I will email you if one person here can remember, it's enough. It wouldn't hurt to have you remind me that I will then email the cover sheet to everybody probably by tomorrow night, at the latest Thursday, definitely before the weekend. And that will be what it'll say, short paper number 2 cover sheet. And of course, you do the same thing with that as you did with the first cover sheet for the first paper. Attach it in the same file as a total PDF file, hopefully all in one file. And of course, label, I already covered, so I'm not going to do it again. Let me stop share here. You attach that all to a single PDF file and send it to markw@aol.com if you want me to get it graded more quickly. If you send it to the Outlook, I'll get it, it'll count, but it might not be able to see it or download it as soon as I can from the AOL website. And also, if you want me to confirm that I got your paper and that there was no problem with it, for me to open it, what have you, you need to say that in the body of your, the text above or below, actually below the file. And of course, you remember how to label it. I already said that at the beginning of today's lecture. And so it's the same way, exact same requirements, same length. And yes, you can write about something other than architecture. I would urge some of you to consider that, because it's something you'll have to do if you're going to take other art history courses, certainly at least one more, even at the 4-year college level. You would be expected to analyze architecture at some point in one of your papers, if not in a whole class. Well, not a whole class, but I mean, as one of the main types of things that you might have to write about. But for this assignment, I'm giving you some flexibility. If you prefer, you can write about sculpture or painting. If you write about architecture, I can point you in the right direction for research sources if you needed that, if you want to ask me. And don't forget, if you want me to read your papers, I can do so. That is, give you feedback, tell you what, if anything is missing, so you know what you might need to change or add. But you got to do that at least 48 hours before it's due. So no later than, say, well, Saturday would be, because it's due Monday, if you want my feedback. And again, you need to say that if you want me to give feedback. Otherwise, I'll think, oh, they're submitting their paper early. There's the final second paper for this student. I won't have any way of knowing unless you stipulate that in your email. It's just to be thorough and cover the basis. Okay. Well, that's all the things I was feeling I needed to make sure you guys know. But anybody have any other questions before we sign off for the night about anything we've covered? Anybody else? Okay, well, good luck with your papers. You have a week, so hopefully you'll all do well, because I think from your first papers what, if anything, you missed, what you need to add to the second one. So maybe I'll see a few of your sample papers. If you've asked me to, I'll give you the feedback. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see all of the papers that you don't want to count as late and have points off by sometime on Monday. And I'll see you all Monday here, of course. All right, that's it.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks for your input, or everybody's, comments and things. It's always helpful to clarify for your fellow students. All right, good night. See you in 1 week. Take care.